So let's go. Having a problem in your bassline can completely ruin your mix either by crowding your low end or by making it sound weak, which essentially makes your sound weak, and I'm sure that you don't want to have this. So today we're gonna cover the most common mistakes that I see producers making when talking about basslines, and also, and more importantly, how can you solve them. But before you begin, let me know over here in the comments if you want me to do a video just like this about kicks or percussions or high-end elements. Let me know over here in the comments and let's get started with this video. Let's go. Monoing your low end or your master below a certain frequency could be causing you more problems than actually helping you. Listen, for example, to the song called Watermelon Wormhole and pay attention to how much bass there is in the stereo field. If you haven't listened to it, pay attention over here in Ableton and see how much stereo there is in the low end. There's a lot of content in the stereo, and when you use a mono maker below a certain frequency, you could be killing all the information that you have in the stereo and making your bass a bit boring. Listen, for example, to the same song but now with a mono maker below 200 Hz. And now without it. Pay attention now only to the low end with it and without it. By using the mono maker, you're making not only your bass less interesting, but you're making your bass weaker in the mix as well, and that could be a problem to you. Essentially, anytime that you're using a drone bass like this one from our recent preset pack that you can see it over here. But now let's listen to everything below 200 Hz. And now let's use a mono maker. Can you notice how the bass line itself becomes a lot less interesting, and by contrast it becomes a lot quieter as well in your mix? But how should you do it then? Instead of using a mono maker, make the elements that you want to mono directly. So for example, if you want your kick to be mono, go to your kick channel and make it mono. Another element that I always recommend making it mono is the sub range. So instead of using a mono maker, pick your sub channel and make it mono. But what is a sub? And that takes us to our next point in this video. Your sub bass is the lowest note that your bass progression is playing, and then normally will stay around 40 to 80 Hz depending on the progression that you're playing. So for you to do the perfect sub, what you need to do over here, you go into any VST, you select a sine wave, and you're gonna put this sine wave between 40 to 80 Hz. And voila, you have your perfect sub. But there's also a bit of problems that I also see a lot of producers doing when it comes to sub basses as well, which takes us to our next point in this video. A really common problem that I see a lot of producers making is either placing their sub bass a bit too high in the spectrum or a bit too low in the spectrum as well. And that could cause you a lot of problems. For example, one thing that I avoid doing at all costs is having my sub notes below 30 Hz or above 100 Hz, because that's essentially too high or too low for the sub bass. But at the same time, my ideal range for the sub bass is within 40 to 80 Hz, and that's where I feel that the sub really shines through the mix. Listen, for example, to this progression over here. Is exactly within 40 to 80 Hz, as you can see it over here in Ableton. And that's really good because, again, it really makes the sub shine through the mix a lot more. But listen to this progression over here and listen to how it sounds like. Over here, you can see two things. None of your notes are falling above 40 Hz, and not only this, but there's one note over here that is falling below 30 Hz, which again is way below what I consider safe for subs. So in that situation, what I would consider is placing this progression one octave up and see how it sounds like. Now everything is contained within that 40 to 80 Hz, and again we are in the sweet spot of the sub bass. But sometimes you're gonna have progressions that are gonna have notes that will go above 80 Hz or below 40 Hz, and what should you do in this situation? Listen, for example, to this case over here. You have two notes that are playing above 40 Hertz, but you have two notes that are playing below 40 Hertz, but all of them are above 30 Hertz, which is the latest that I would go. And that's a situation that is fine to me. So whenever you're making your sub progression, considering leaving your sub always within 30 to 100 Hertz, but favor everything below 40 to 80 Hertz, and you're gonna have a really good time with that. But now that we've solved the sub bass, we're gonna now talk about the rest of the bass. And can the rest of the bass be stereo? Another really common misconception is that you can have the rest of the bass be stereo, and that's a problem because you could make your basses more interesting by making them stereo. For example, listen to this song over here called Life on Hold by Nora En Pure. If you're not being able to listen to what is happening, you can also see it over here. You can see that there's a lot of content over here in the stereo field, and listen to what happens when you put this bass in mono. But now in stereo, in addition to being louder, it's also a lot more interesting, and that could be a problem if you're making all your basses mono, because you're losing a lot of information that could be making your basses more interesting to listen to. So for example, if you listen to this bass over here, feel free to leave it in stereo, but I always recommend having your sub in mono. So how can you isolate the sub from the bass that is already to stereo? And that takes us to our next point in this video. But how can we isolate the sub from the bass? So the most common way to doing this is using an EQ. And by using an EQ, you're going to cut off essentially the bass from the sub. And you can do this simply by looking at your progression, understanding what is the lowest note. So we're gonna go in this table over here, and the lowest note is E. We're gonna do a cut that is two notes up, so D sharp, D, 73 Hertz. We're gonna go back to Ableton, and over here in Ableton, if we do a 48 dB cut at 73 Hertz, you can see that a lot of the sub is going to be cut from the bass that you had before. However, when you do this, you're gonna leave a bit of leftovers because this is a static cut and the notes changes, so the sub notes changes as well. So how can you do it better? Well, the only way that I know how to do it better is if you're using Serum, the first thing that you're gonna do is deactivate your sub layer. And if you still have sub going on, you're gonna go into the wavetable editor, process, and remove the fundamental. And this is going to remove the fundamental wave or the sub wave of your bassline. And this removes it dynamically and not using an EQ, which if you don't know how to use it for your basslines, it could cause you some problems as well. And that takes us to our next point in this video. Not having a consistent low end is not technically a problem, but it's definitely something to avoid when doing basslines. And that is because you don't want one note of your sub to sound like this and one note of the sub to be a lot louder than the other one. Listen, for example, to what happened visually, but also in a spectrum when I EQ'd this bassline. Let's focus now on the sub-region of this bass, which consists of these four notes over here. Essentially, can you see how the lowest note is playing at minus 25 dB and the highest note is playing at minus 13 dB? It's a 12 dB difference within the same scale. I'm 100% sure that you don't want this in your basslines because you don't want one note to be really quiet and one note to be really loud. So how can you do this? Again, when you don't have EQs in your subs and you're using just a sine wave, listen to how it sounds like, and also while looking at a spectrum. You can see that when I have no effects on my bass lines, the bass notes are already at the same level, and that's exactly what I want for my sub. And the same thing can be said for the bass line, as you can listen over here. When you don't have much EQing in the sound, you're gonna guarantee that all the notes are going to play at the same level, and you're going to have, as you can see it over here in the spectrum, a consistent experience throughout all the notes. And that applies also when you're talking about the drop 1 and the drop 2 of your song. You don't want the drop 1 to have one loudness in the bass line and the drop 2 to have another loudness in the bass line, because you want your listener to have a consistent experience. So the loudness of your bass in a drop 1 should be the same as the loudness of the drop 2 in your song to maintain a consistent consistent experience when listening to your song. And that is a problem that a lot of people are trying to solve by compressing the bass line, which takes us to our next point in this video. Another thing that I see a lot of producers doing is compressing their bass lines, but again, I don't normally compress my bass lines because I do it from the source. The only two reasons that I compress my bass lines is if I want to contain the peak loudness of the bass, as you can see it over here. Can you check how, for example, this peak of this bass is a lot bigger than the peak of this bass? So if I want to contain the peak loudness of the bass and make it a bit more sausagey, that's when I would use a compressor. The second reason why I compress my bass lines a lot is sometimes I want to use it as a sound design tool, and I compress it a lot to distort the sound and make a really cool sound out of it. But if I want to make sure that the levels of my basses are the same, I definitely would not recommend compressing the bass lines because that could possibly create more problems than actually help you as well. Again, make sure to have the elements from the source, they already have the same loudness, and this could help you a lot. For example, as we've seen in the sub bass, you can see that not only it looks flat when you render it, but it also sounds flat when we listen over here in the spectrum. Therefore, before compressing your bass to make your notes a bit more even, make sure that you don't have either an EQ that is changing the notes or even some saturation that is making the notes change the levels and become a bit uneven as well. But now there's also some mistakes that I see producers making regarding to bass lines, but they are more regarding to arrangement and energy of the song, and that takes us to the next point in this video. I see a lot of producers leaving the bass lines in the breakdown at the same loudness of the drop, which is not technically a problem, but it could be a problem when the bass line in the breakdown is louder than the drop. Listen, for example, to this song over here where the breakdown bass is a lot louder than in the drop bass. Even though the song is more exciting in the high end, the low end loses a lot of energy and it makes the drop a bit anticlimactic. And listen to how this song technically should be like. You can see that now we have a lot less breakdown bass, and now this makes the drop even more exciting and even more impacting, and that's exactly why we lowered the bassline break a little bit more. What I normally do in my basslines is I pick the level of the drop, I put the breakdown at the same level, and then I purposely lowered it in 3 or 4 dBs. So this way I'm guaranteeing that my breakdown bass is definitely quieter than my drop. So whenever the drop comes, the bass over there is gonna hit you a lot louder, and this is going to make your drop a bit more impacting and a bit more energetic than the breakdown. But there's also another thing that you can do to make the drop even more impacting, and that's something that also can wreck the bassline of your breakdown as well. And that takes us to our next point in this video. If you want your basslines to be louder than the drop in the breakdown, even after what I said to you, one little thing that I would recommend to you is sucking up the energy of the song by cutting the bassline before the drop actually comes. And you can do this with any EQ and automation. Now listen, for example, to how this drop sounds like without this trick. Even though this is still impacting, there's a little bit of bass right before the drop, and a way to get more energy in the drop is by fading away the bass with a low-end cut filter. Over here in Ableton, you can see that we have an automation that starts at 0 and it goes up to around 400 to 600 Hertz, and essentially this is going to suck up the energy of the bass right before the break, and this is going to give a lot more punch in the drop, as you can listen over here. By shaping up the bass right before the drop, we give more power to the drop, and that's another problem that could be making your song a bit anticlimactic when you have a lot of bass right before the drop as well. Now, everything over here doesn't really matter if you don't sidechain your bass properly to your kick. And for that, you can see this video over here, or if you want to learn how you can sidechain not only the bass line but also other elements, you can also see this video over here where I fix the most common mixing mistakes that I've seen producers making. I hope you liked the video, and I hope to see you soon. Cheers!